Good morning, BookTube. It's me, Tony, here from Locks to Reads. And today I wanted to talk about Up the Line to Death, which is a poetry collection edited by Gardner that was originally published in 1964 and got a reissue in 2007, which updated some of the poets' biographies that are in the back of it. It has a foreword by Edmund Blunden, who obviously was still alive at that point. And it's a collection of 138 poems from 72 poets. Now, of those poets, 47 get one poem each, 10, including Rupert Brooke, get two, 8 get 3, including Richard Alderton, Robert Graves, and C.H. Sawley, C.H. Sawley is now virtually forgotten, but John Masefield said Sawley was potentially the greatest poet lost in the war, which is some claim. Wilfred Owen, Isaac Rosenberg, and Kipling get 5. Eben Blunden gets 7. Wilfred Gibson, who was working as a social worker in the East End, gets 8, and Siegfried Sassoon gets 13. One of the poets who wrote a single poem in this collection is A.A. Milne, who, as you know, went on to do Winnie the Pooh. Now, of the poets, some of them are well known, but didn't serve. So Thomas Hardy, A.E. Housman, Rudyard Kipling, Sir Henry Newbolt, W B Yeats. Now, W B Yeats's poem in here is an Irish airman foresees his death, which I'm not going to read because I'm going to read a lot of other poems. But what I wanted to say was that Yeats was not a big fan of war poetry, and when he did a Oxford Book of Modern Poetry in 1936, and he explicitly said in that introduction, "I have a great dislike for certain poems written in the midst of the Great War. I have rejected these poems. Passive suffering is not a theme for poetry," which is something. And then Harold Monroe and E.E. Cummings served in, well, Harold Monroe was in an anti-aircraft factory, and Cummings worked as an ambulance driver on the Western Front for a short period until he was interned by the French. I don't quite know what happened after that. But the rest of the poets were on the front line, effectively. Now, the front line was in different places. There was airmen. There's poetry from poets from soldiers from the Western Front, from Mesopotamia, from East Africa. Now, of the poets, 20 of them were killed in action. 4 in 1915, 6 in 1916, 5 in 1917, and 5 in 1918. And one, John McCrae, who's best known for In Flanders Fields, the poppies grow between the crosses row on row, in 1919 of pneumonia. And the survivors died gradually until Robert Graves became the last of them to die in 1985, and which is interesting. Now, there's a certain common social class in here. 28 of them went to Oxford or Cambridge universities. And one went to Princeton, and one, E.E. Cummings, went to Yale. 7 went to Eton, but they're not all posh. But they were but they ended up mostly being junior officers. Not all of them. Isaac Rosenberg wasn't, for example. And junior officers have a high casualty rate in World War One. It's 17% to the ordinary soldiers, 12%, which is why I think so many of them in here died. Now, it's structured. Now, unusually for this, it's effectively he's trying to tell a story. Gardner's trying to tell a story. So he says in his introduction he tried to make sure this collection had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, I'm going to talk about each chapter very briefly, and I'm going to do some readings from different parts of them. So the first chapter is Happy in England Now, which is the poetry written in 1914. which is obviously tonally very different to what is to come later, particularly after the Somme in 1916. I'm going to read W.N. Hodgson's poem from August 1914 called England to Her Sons. Sons of mine, I hear you thrilling to the trumpet call of war. Gird ye then, I give you freely, as I gave your sires before, all the noblest children I in love and anguish bore. Free in service, wise in justice, fearing but dishonour's breath, still to suffer uncomplaining loss and failure, pain and death. Strong in faith that sees the issue, and in hope that triumpheth. Go, and may the God of battles you in his good guidance keep. And if he in wisdom giveth unto his beloved sleep, I accept it, nothing asking, save a little space to weep. It sounds quite old-fashioned, that poem, with its triumph-finesse. And I'm going to read very shortly a different poem from Hodgson that's tonally very different and linguistically pretty different. Then the next chapter was Field Manoeuvres. Now I'm going to read from Field Manoeuvres. There's what I think is one of my favourite poems, which is Magpies in Picardy, by T.P. Cameron Wilson. Take a breath. Magpies in Picardy. The magpies in Picardy are more than I can tell. They flicker down the dusty roads and cast a magic spell on the men who march through Picardy to hell. The blackbird flies with panic, the swallow goes with light, the finches move like ladies, the owl floats by at night, but the great and flashing magpie, he flies as artists might. A magpie in Picardy told me secret things, of the music in white feathers, and the sunlight that sings and dances in deep shadows. He told me with his wings. The hawk is cruel and rigid, he watches from a height. The rook is slow and sombre, the robin loves to fight. But the great and flashing magpie, he flies as lovers might. He told me that in Picardy, an age ago or more, while all his feathers still were eggs, these dusty highways bore brown singing soldiers marching out through Picardy to war. He said that still through chaos works on the ancient plan, and two things have altered not since first the world began, the beauty of the wild green earth and the bravery of man. For the sparrow flies unthinking and quarrels in his flight, the heron trails his legs behind, the lark goes out of sight, but the great and flashing magpie, he flies as poets might. So that's T.P. Wilson. Now, interestingly, T.P. Wilson's sister, Marjorie, wrote a poem, which I'm going to read as well, called To Tony, Aged 3, in memory of TPCW, that's in this collection, Scars Upon My Heart, Women's Poetry and Verse of the First World War, selected by Catherine Reilly. And when you hear this one and you think back to Magpies in Picardy, it actually kind of hits quite hard. Gemmed with white daisies was the great green world. Your restless feet pressed this long day through. Come now and let me whisper to your dreams a little song grown from my love for you. There was a man once loved green fields like you. He drew his knowledge from the wild birds' songs, and he had praise for every beauteous thing, and he had pity for all piteous wrongs. A lover of earth's forests, of her hills, and brother to her sunlight, to her rain, man with a boy's fresh wonder, he was great with greatness all too simple to explain. He was a dreamer and a poet, and brave to face and hold what he alone found true. He was a comrade of the old, a friend to every little laughing child like you. And when, across the peaceful English land, unhurt by war, the light is growing dim, and you remember by your shadowed bed all those, the brave, you must remember him, and know it was for you to bear his name, and such as you that all his joys he gave, his love of quiet fields, his youth, his life, to win that heritage of peace you have. And also from that section, I'm going to read the second poem by W.N. Hodgson. Now, this was written 2 days before he died, on the first day of the Somme in July 1916. Before action, by all the glories of the day and the cool evening's benizons, by the last sunset touch that lay upon the hills when day was done, by beauty lavishly outpoured and blessings carelessly received, by all the days that I have lived, make me a soldier, Lord. By all of man's hope and fears, and all the wonders poets sing, the laughter of unclouded years, and every sad and loving thing. By the romantic ages stored with high endeavours that were his, by all his mad catastrophes, make me a man, O Lord. I saw that on my familiar hill, saw with uncomprehending eyes, 100 of thy sunsets spill their fresh and sanguine sacrifice, ere the sun swings his noonday sword. Must say goodbye to all of this, by all delights that I shall miss, help me to die, O Lord. Now there is some thought that he knew he was going to die on the first day of the sun, because he was aware of what he was about to walk into. But I think it's interesting to compare the sort of tone and language of that poem with the first one from 1914. Then Tipperary Days. Now Tipperary Days is sort of about the sort of the, I'm about to use the word faffing, but the pre-battle part of warfare. To Unknown Lands, it covers areas and not the Western Front, so you get poetry from pilots, from Gallipoli, from Mesopotamia, from POW camps, from on a troop ship, from East Africa. And then the next chapter is the home front. It's very unusual to get a home front poem. I'm going to read one which is called Air Raid. It is interesting how the German air war on England, on Britain in World War One, sort of been erased from popular consciousness. It went on throughout the war. There were 103 raids in total, about half by airship or Zeppelin, and half by aeroplane. About 1,400 people were killed, and about 3,400 were injured in those bombings. And it seems to have been sort of, as I said, been slightly erased from popular consciousness. Anyway, I'm going to read Air Raid. It's by Wilfred Gibson. Night shatters in mid-heaven, the bark of guns, the roar of planes, the crash of bombs, and all the unshackled sky pandemonium. Sorry, I'm going to start that one again. Air Raid. Night shatters in mid-heaven, the bark of guns, the roar of planes, the crash of bombs, and all the unshackled sky pandemonium stuns the senses to indifference. When a fall of masonry nearby startles awake, tingling, wide-eyed, prick-eared, with bristling hair, each sense within the body crouched aware, like some sore-hunted creature in the brake. Yet, side by side we lie in the little room, just touching hands, with eyes and ears that strain, keenly, yet dream-bewildered through tense gloom, listening, in helpless stupor of insane, drugged nightmare panic, fantastically wild, to the quiet breathing of our little child. I think you could probably read that poem, probably cover any air raid any time thereafter, World War II or wherever, Ukraine, Palestine. It's a sort of poem that lives forever, that one. And then you get Death's Kingdom, which is well, it says what it says. We're more into the war here, and the Somme is happening, and as Gardner says in his introduction, after the Somme, nothing was ever the same. I'm going to read In Memoriam by E.A. Mackintosh, who was killed in action. Well, killed in action in 1916, which makes this poem even more painfully ironic. In Memoriam, Private D. Sutherland killed in action in the German trench May 16th, 1916, and the others who died. So you were David's father, and he was your only son, and the new cut pizza rotting, and the work is left undone, because of an old man weeping, just an old man in pain, for David, his son David, that will not come again. Oh, the letters he wrote you, and I can see them still, not a word of the fighting, but just the sheep on the hill, and how you should get the crops in ere the year got stormier, and the Boches have got his body, and I was his officer. You were only David's father, but I had 50 sons, when we went up that evening under the arch of guns. And we came back at twilight. Oh God, I heard them call to me for help and pity that could not help at all. Oh, never will I forget you, my men that trusted me, more my sons than your fathers, for they could only see the little helpless babies and the young men in their pride. They could not see you dying and hold you while you died. Happy and young and gallant, they saw their firstborn go, but not the strong limbs broken and the beautiful men brought low. The piteous writhing bodies, they screamed, "Don't leave me, sir," for they were only your fathers, but I was your officer. As I said, that was written for a man that died on May the 16th, 1916, and before 1916 was out, E.A. Mackintosh was dead as well. Then the next section is a bitter taste. Now that says exactly what it says, and in fact the poem to read from that sort of sums it up is Base Details by Siegfried Sassoon. Base Details. If I were fierce and bald and short of breath, I'd live with scarlet majors at the base and speed glum heroes up the line to death. You'd see me with my puppy petulant face, guzzling and gulping in the best hotel, reading the Roll of Honour. Poor young chap, I'd say. I used to know his father well. Yes, we've lost heavily in this last scrap. And when the war is done and youth stone dead, I toddle home safely and die in bed. I slightly misread that one, by the way, but you can look, you can find it yourselves. But you can see the tone has shifted. Siegfried Sassoon is the, as I said, there's 13 of his poems in this collection, and I think he's the centre of his tone is the centre of Brian Gardner's view of the world, of World War One. Then there's Behind the Lines, which is more about rest and relaxation while before fighting. Then there's Oh Jesus, Make It Stop, which is a chapter title taken from the last line of another Siegfried Sassoon poem, Attack, which is in this collection. I'm going to read Louse Hunting from this one because it's unusual, by Isaac Rosenberg, and it's slightly odd and strange and pagan, but I think it's a really fascinating poem. Louse Hunting. Nudes, stark and glistening, yelling in lurid glee, grinning faces and raging limbs, well over the floor on fire. For a shirt verminously busy, yon soldier tore from his throat, with oaths as God head might shrink at, but not the lice. And soon the shirt was aflare, over the candidly lit where we lay. Then we all sprung up and stripped, to hunt the verminous brood. Soon like a demon's pantomime, this plunge was raging. See the silhouettes agape, see the gibbering shadows, mixed with the baffled arms on the wall. See gargantuan hooked fingers pluck in supreme flesh to smutch supreme littleness. See the merry limbs in that highland fling, because some wizard vermin willed to charm from the quiet this revel, when our ears were half lulled by the dark music blown from sleep's trumpet. I really like that poem, and I'm not entirely sure why. I think that's the thing with poetry sometimes. It can affect you. Somebody once said that all art aspires to the condition of music. Walter Pater, I believe. And I might be misconstruing its meaning, but what I think is that means that it gets past your conscious thinking and hits you emotionally, either because and sometimes it's aesthetically and sometimes it's just emotionally, and that poem for some reason really gets me. And then there's finally At Last, which is basically about the end of the war. Now that I'm going to read one poem from there. Now Kipling, at the beginning of the war, was quite I won't say pro-war, but he was quite jingoistic. But during the war, his son Jack was killed at Loos in September 1915. Now, initially, Jack couldn't get into the army because he was so short-sighted. But strings were pulled and he found himself in the army. And I think Kipling felt guilty about that forever. And his poetry towards the end of the war turns quite dark. He also wrote a poem called My Boy Jack, which became the title of David Haig's play, which then became the title of the 2007 TV adaptation, which has Daniel Radcliffe's Jack. But My Boy Jack was actually written about Jack Cornwall. Now, Jack Cornwall was a 16-year-old sailor who won a Victoria Cross posthumously for staying at his post at the Battle of Jutland, and you can see that in the way the poem talks about the sea, but you can also see that My Boy Jack is a poem about his boy Jack, and it has a sort of emotional heft to it as a result. This one is A Dead Statesman. You probably know this poem because it comes up every so often. And again, it's an evergreen poem we could use to talk about many a modern day statesman. I could not dig, I dared not rob, therefore I lies to plead the mob. Now all my lies are proved untrue, and I must face the men I slew. What tale shall serve me here among mine angry and defrauded young? Aye. Now, I found myself thinking about Jack Kipling then for a second, and Rudyard Kipling, and then finally there's an epilogue by Philip Johnson. Now, there isn't much about Philip Johnson in the biography at the end, but I was looking to find some stuff about it, and it turns out there's an article by the University of York about this, but it was actually a guy called John Stanley Purvis who died in 1968, and he published this poem anonymously, and they only got found out about after his death in 1968. The article, I'll put a link to the article here in the show notes below. And John Purvis, his brother had died in 1917 in the war, and he was quite shell shocked and found at the end of the war was, but then post war he became a clergyman and an archivist, and founded what was then called the Borthwick Institute for Archives but is now part of the University of York, hence the article for the University of York. And they found one of his notebooks in 2023, well, his war notebook in 2023, which nobody knew existed, and has been published since, although I haven't got a copy of it. But this High Wood is basically, this is the epilogue to the poetry collection, and it is, it imagines a post-war tour of the battlefields, and it was published in February 1918, so the war hadn't even finished at this point. High Wood. Ladies and gentlemen, this is High Wood, called by the French Bois de Fourneau, the famous spot which in 1916, July, August and September, was the scene of long and bitterly contested strife by reason of its high commanding site. Observe the effect of shell fire in the trees, standing and fallen. Here is the wire. This trench, for months inhabited, 12 times changed hands, they soon fall in, used later as a grave. It has been said on good authority that in the fighting for this patch of wood were killed somewhere above 8,000 men, of whom the greater part were buried here. This mound on which you stand being, Madam, please, you are requested kindly not to touch or take away the company's property as souvenirs. You will find we have on sale a large variety, all guaranteed. As I was saying, all is as it was. This is an unknown British officer, the tunic having lately rotted off. Please follow me this way. The path, sir, please. The ground, which was secured at great expense, the company keeps absolutely untouched, and in that dugout, genuine, we provide refreshments at a reasonable rate. You're requested not to leave about paper or ginger beer bottles or orange peel. There are waste paper baskets at the gate. And that's how this collection ends. There's a sort of air of cynicism to it, which is the sort of air that World War One poetry often seems to have, and I think that misses out that it also has love, grief. there's a fascination with nature. I think because a lot of these people came from a tradition, a poetic tradition, of like Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, Byron, classical authors, and they took that into their war poetry. The thing you do notice, and I haven't read any of Wilfred Owen's poem because I think that he is his poetry is the most well known in here, but you do notice that when his poems arrive in this collection, he is, I think, a level above pretty much every other writer in this collection. The poems just have an impact and an aesthetic pleasure, for want of a better phrase, so that they work both as protest poems, and as works of art. That sounds very pretentious, but I think I know what I mean. So yes, I recommend this collection, but you will find a lot of these poems in other collections. I think everybody should have at least one World War One poetry and an anthology in their collection. I think everybody should have Wilfred Owen's poems in their collection. And it may what this book does very well by its structure is makes you think about the cause of the war, and what the men went through in a way that sometimes when you get other anthologies, like it's done by poet or it's done by and it's always done in publication. They're structured in different ways, and they don't always have. This had quite an impact on me. I've read a chunk of these poems before, and I'm aware of the sort of general tone of World War One poetry, but the variety of authors, the variety of different types of poem. Some of them are, I mean, not all the poems are great, but not all the poetry is great. He says in the introduction the same thing. But I recommend this collection or another anthology of World War One poems. What I wanted to do is this video's gone on a bit longer because I read so much poetry, and I read some of them very badly, and I apologise for that. But what I wanted to do was show the breadth of the type of poetry that was written in World War One, and how and what we need to think about is how that has impacted our perception of the war itself. Tomorrow I might talk about a memoir written by a frontline soldier who was a regular before World War One started and stayed in the army until 1918, which has a very different tone and to it, as a comparison. Anyway, I'm sorry that went on for so long. I hope you enjoy it. You can probably find better readings of those poems on YouTube somewhere. If I ever win a lot of money, I will re-record this video and get actors to read the poems. Thank you anyway. Have a good rest of the Saturday wherever you are, and speak soon. Bye bye.